Superannuation is a false economy. Effectively, today, 40% of people that retire with a mortgage. That's up from 10% in 1992. We still have the same percentage of retirees on a pension as what we did in 1992. So we're not reducing the load off, it's not fixing it at all. The tax concessions for superannuation that mainly go to the upper 20%, and I'm one of them, is about $60 billion a year. There's another $30 to $40 billion a year in fees, and of the $4 trillion in superannuation, over $1 trillion of it is now invested offshore. So that money is leaving the country, and when it should be invested in infrastructure here. When you control $3 trillion in capital, you control industry. So every time you land on a plane and they do a welcome to country, when they back the voice or they're pushing all this woke stuff, that's all coming from the boardrooms of these superannuation funds. And you wonder why we're going backwards as a country, because they're pushing all this woke ideology instead of being driven by productivity.
Very insightful.
Yeah.
Gerard, thanks for joining us. Parents with Questions.
Yeah,
nice
cheers,
to
thanks.
see you in person.
Yeah, likewise, Adam. Good to be here.
We spoke on stage in Canberra, February 22.
Yep.
We've got some photos of us chatting and remember meeting you for the first time in person. In front of, I don't know, a million or more people, whatever it was, millions or hundreds of thousands at the very least. What's life been like as an Australian since then? What have you seen unfold since 3 years ago, I guess now, 3 and a bit? What are the main themes have you seen unfold in that time?
Well, the main theme for me, from the point of view of the people, is that the government has made it clearly obvious that they're not interested in the concerns of the Australian people. And the classic example of that was the way that the people who were injured by the vaccine were treated. I can understand early on why people, who didn't know enough or were genuinely worried about COVID. I can understand, regardless of what the truth was, given the propaganda that was put out by the government at the time. Generally we're used to politicians lying, but we're not used to medical professionals lying. And I think what we saw was, as a result of the COVID rollout, a couple of things. Obviously, it was obvious that it never stopped transmission. So that was a lie that was very quickly exposed. And the government and health professionals have grudgingly had to accept that. But what they have never accepted is the extent and the magnitude of people injured by the vaccine. Now, yet again, let's just say, and I do actually think this, that most people in government and most health professionals believed what they were told about the severity of the COVID vaccine, of COVID itself, the virus. I was always sceptical. My view was that, sure, like any virus, we've got to protect the older people and the vulnerable people with health issues. No issues there. Sure. But I always thought it was government overreach in regards to the way that healthy people of working age population were managed, along with our children and the way they were withheld from school, et cetera, et cetera. So that's obviously what I'd call part one of the COVID hysteria and government overreach. And then there's actually part two is the economic consequences of that, which we're suffering subsequently since 22 onwards. But the third part, of course, was the rollout of the vaccine. Now, like I said, most people at the start, they're not biochemists, they don't understand, immunology, biochemistry and things like that. So they're just going to go, okay, I'll get the vaccine if that's what it takes to get my job back. The fact that it was rolled out, and people were basically pressured was wrong. So the mandate level was wrong, regardless of whether or not it was safe. I still think it was wrong, especially for people of healthy working age population. Like it was just, but anyway, even so, let's just put that part of the totalitarianism aside. Once people were injured, they were gaslighted, and their injuries are being ignored. And that lie has persisted till this very day. I mean, I've just finished up another night in estimates with TGA, where they, constantly repeated that the benefits outweighed the risks, and that's not true in my view at all. Absolutely. And that's so. For that, that's the first thing that we've learnt in 3 years. Economically, what we've seen, so we've now, because of the poor economic management of COVID, but it wasn't, COVID was the match that lit the fuse, in my view, of 40 years of bad economic policy. And obviously when you go and print $300 billion and pay people to stay at home and get brainwashed by the premiers, you're going to end up with an economic problem down the track. And that was what, I did a post the other day where I put out text messages I sent to the Prime Minister, Scott Morrison, and Matthias Cormann at the time saying, how are we going to deal with this? How are we going to pay off the debt? You're going to cause inflation. I predicted that right back in March 2020. But what's annoying is, so in this particular term of government, we've had the first 18 months where we spoke about the voice. So we divided the population based on race. And then the next 18 months, and that was led by the Labor Party, the next 18 months is that the coalition have exploited the whole Gaza-Israel issue into let's create another crisis here in Australia based on something that's happening overseas. Now, what's happening overseas is valid in terms of it's a valid issue, it's a legitimate issue, and I understand why many Australians are concerned about it.
Sure.
But it shouldn't be, the fear-mongering should not be, and by the media as well, should not be stoked, being inflamed. So, because we've got a cost of living problem here, and number one, why did the Albanese government, but it wouldn't have been much different under the coalition, allow immigration to go so high? And the reason I can answer that is that they needed immigrants to come in and buy houses as those interest rates increased. Because what happens with this, when times get tough, what happens in Australia is that people who live in Sydney and Melbourne, as they retire, as they struggle with their mortgage, if it gets too much to keep, they sell their house, they cash out, and then they move to Queensland or Western Australia or South Australia to a lesser degree. That is how this has been managed. And then what they do is, and then they rely on the immigrants, and they sell out to wealthy immigrants who come in and buy these houses to keep propping up the market.
Gotcha.
So, but of course, the overall long-term impact of that is for those people at the bottom of the food chain who they'll ultimately end up not being able to find a place to rent, or homeless, or they have to go back and live with mum and dad, or their situation gets worse, not better. So they're still focused, and even this week with the Chinese warships, off the coast of Australia in international waters, the coalition's blaming Albanese for the handling of that, right? Well, there's a lot of issues I have with Anthony Albanese, but he can't control where the Chinese Navy goes in international waters.
Sure.
And I'm not exactly sure what the coalition expect from Albanese and why they're trying to stoke that particular element up. But that's what the coalition's known for. Labor will run fear-mongering issues over health and education. They do it all the time. Labor are now trying to create a Medicare scare against coalition. The coalition's trying to create a border security issue scare against Albanese. And they do this, of course, to keep everyone afraid, and rather than talk about solutions and actually implement solutions. And the reason they don't talk about solutions is they actually don't know how to fix the problem that's been created over the last 40 years.
Yeah, gotcha.
Yeah.
That's a very good synopsis. Thank you.
Yeah.
I want to ask about people first, and what you're doing in there. But I think it's just worth pointing out for those listening. You, as I understand it, you're an economist, or you've got qualifications in economics, finance, tax reform. Is that correct? So
Yeah.
You've got a background in this space.
Okay, so I'm actually a qualified accountant. I'm not an economist. So the economists are, like in the food chain, you generally have treasury accountants, tax accountants, financial accountants, management accountants, auditors. Auditors do a good job. It's a hard job, but it's a shitty job, pardon the French. And then, economists don't deal in the real world, they deal in models.
Theoretically.
So theoretically. So if you dig a hole for $50, if you dig a hole and I pay you $50 to dig a hole, and then I'll pay you another $50 to fill it, the economists will calculate that to be $100 in GDP. Right now, an accountant would say that's a $100 loss.
Gotcha.
Right, so we actually record things that take place, and we're held liable for that, right? So, you can go to jail if you don't do a proper set of accounts. Auditors have to then audit your set of accounts. Like if I say there's $500 in a bank account, or say, you're a big company, there's $2 million in a bank account, the auditor will come in, they will ring the bank and look for the bank statement and says you've got $2 million. So we actually have to, try and represent as closely as possible, and that's for the people, that's for accountants who are doing their job properly, represent as accurately as possible what the company's doing, report that back to shareholders or report that back to government. Economists don't do that, just so you know. So, but yeah, I've got a Bachelor of Commerce. I've got a Masters of Tax Law from Sydney University, where we basically deal with the Tax Act. I've also got a Masters of Finance in Treasury. And that came about when I was a Treasury accountant. So I did the books for the Bank of Queensland and Westfield. So I did both sides of the ledger, where we have to go out and borrow money from offshore. And then we've got to, so it's not just the physical debt you have to borrow, because we don't have an onshore bond market. We borrow in US dollars. And then in order to swap that US out into Aussie, to eliminate the risk, you've got to take out a cross-currency swap. If you're lending, bond markets offer fixed rates of interest, not variable, so then you've got to do another interest rate swap to swap that back out into variable. I have to do all the accounting for that, and all that stuff has to be completely hedged so that there's no risk. Because obviously if you've got, say, Westfield had $20 billion in physical debt, most of it's US based. If that was a 2% swing in the currency, that would be 400, what's my sums now, 200 million's 1%. So that could be a 400 million swing if you don't pop in your currency exposure, if you're not hedging your debt properly. So I'm not the one doing the deals. I have to do the accounting on those deals and make sure the hedging there. So plus tax, plus, I've been also like a financial accountant as well at the Bank of Queensland. I did banking operations whereby every day we'd settle overnight checks, credit card payments, cash payments, BPay, all that stuff you do when you go in and do your online banking. There's all these different payment systems. So I had a team of 15 and we'd have to reconcile that every day, iron out the issues with other banks. So that's where I've got my banking knowledge from as well. And then prior to that, I had 7 years overseas. I worked 3 years out of Amsterdam, where I was flying around the world lodging financial account statements. I worked in the UK for 2 years. And prior to that, I worked in a small accounting practice out of Dalby, where I was doing the books and lodging tax returns and stuff.
So we're talking some real world experience, very accountable, and that's what I like about what you're saying. It's coming from solutions and real world advice. It's not we're not theoretical models and political speak.
And I mean, I could talk about this. I don't want to bore your listeners with sort of the history of economics over the last 40 years. But one of the things I'll be talking about tomorrow night here in Melbourne is how we've gone off track economically over the last 40 years, and it's really, really important, because probably one of the most destructive economic policies was in 1985, and I was just a 15-year-old boy at that stage, when Paul Keating lifted capital controls. Because what that meant was that banks could go offshore and borrow foreign debt. Now, in 1985, we had $8 billion in foreign debt. I say we, the four major banks. By 2008, they had $800 billion in foreign debt, right? And nearly all that money was lent against housing. So what that did was take the price of houses from 4 times earnings to 12 times earnings, and parents with questions. You'll appreciate this. Suddenly you need 2 parents to go back to work to pay the mortgage, right? And that then led to the creation of the childcare industry. So 40 years ago, you'd get your neighbour or grandma or granddad or someone to look after your children. Today, of course, childcare is it's subsidised $15 billion by the federal government, and there'd probably be other things there as well. It is a big industry, but that all came about because we lifted capital controls. Now, the other thing is, by 2008, when we had the $800 billion in foreign debt, it was the GFC, right? So what happened then, there was the risk of going to be a housing collapse. So they had to then change the rules for immigration. And what they said was, if you're a student, you can buy a house while you're living in Australia. So, of course, wealthy people from many other countries saw this as an opportunity to go and buy real estate in Australia. And that is why then since 2008, you've seen the university sector really take off in regards to foreign students. That all comes back to propping up the debt that was created by that bubble back in 1985.
Makes sense.
Yeah, because so when I was at Bank of Queensland, we were 60% foreign funded. So what that meant was, when Keating lifted capital controls in 1985, the only money that a retail bank could lend out was the money that other people saved. So as you got older, pensioners and retirees, whatever, they would have, or even in your working career, you would put your savings, this is before superannuation, you would put your savings in your bank. The bank would then take those savings and lend it out, okay? And what that meant was that the amount of money they could lend was tied to the amount of money people saved. So we could never live beyond our means. Does that make sense? Whereas if, and you can relate to this, if you're an 18-year-old and a bank was irresponsible and they gave you a $100,000 credit card, and you could go overseas and take a Kentucky trip and all this other stuff, you could blow it all up in a heartbeat, right? So this is what they were irresponsible. By lifting capital controls, they allowed this debt bubble to be created, and then we're paying for it now. So the first generation loved it, right? Because they made a killing on asset appreciation, right? But now we're coming into the stage where the next generations, and especially younger children, they just can't afford a house, and it's killing them, right? Because you don't have to just pay childcare because two parents have to go back to work. Almost 12% of your income now, will be 12% in a couple of months, comes out of your wage, out of your top line, and goes into superannuation. So you can't even pay your house off. And it's, when you think about it, it might be 12% of your top line, but for many people on median or less than median incomes, it's 100%, if not more than 100% of their entire savings. Because if you're on 70 grand or at 75 grand and you pay 15 grand tax, so you're back to 60, 50 grand to live on, that last 12% of 70 grand, 8,400, of that last 10,000, nearly all of it's gone to super. So suddenly, how are you going to save for a house when all your money's going to superannuation, your HECS debt, or into childcare?
Yeah, and let's be honest, since you go back to 3 years ago when we last spoke, the cost of living in that time has gone through the roof.
Absolutely, because, and so you've had the 40 years, and then that same year in 1985, the John Button, a Victorian senator, introduced the Button Plan. And that's where he said, oh, we're not going to worry about manufacturing anymore. We can't compete. We're going to lift all the tariffs. And of course, what we've seen in the last 40 years now is that our manufacturing has gone offshore, but not just that. And this is why we've got a skills crisis today. And as I said, I was 15 at the time. So some of my best mates were leaving school at that time. So we were the last generation where we can remember people leaving school in grade 9, grade 10, and there'd be less people finishing grade 12, like less than half the people would finish grade 12 that started grade 8, right? So 40 years on, that's now 40 years this year, they're all retiring. And that next generation of tradies and people with skills, I mean, there's still tradies people, but there's not as many.
There's not enough.
Yeah, not enough. That's the key word there. They're not coming through.
Yep.
And instead, what we've got now is children spending another 8 years. So they go 2 years of high school, another 3 years of uni, if not 4 years. There's another 6 years. And not only when they come out of university, they're coming out with a HECS debt. So, whereas an apprentice, if you started off 6 years down the track, if you could stay home with mum or whatever and dad, they might at least have $50,000 to $100,000 deposit for a house, and because they're in the industry or they got the skill set, they can probably get their mates to build the house a bit cheaper. Otherwise,
absolutely. Yeah.
So we're de-skilling ourselves, but at the same time becoming more vulnerable in terms of all that debt we've got. Now, take COVID on top of that 40 years of going. So you add in the 80. So capital controls and Button in 1985. Dawkins Plan in 1990, which encouraged everyone to go to university. You might remember that Dawkins Plan. And then 1992 with superannuation. It started off at 2%, but is now 12%, right? So when it started off at 2%, everyone was like, but gradually, like a little, frog in boiling water, they've ramped that right up. So we've now got this situation whereby productivity going down, our skill, don't have the same skills. COVID comes along, just completely blows us up economically in terms. So we went from 500 billion in debt to $1 trillion in debt. Lots of inflation. So that's why we're at now. We've got to unravel all of those structural issues.
Well, let's get into that part, because this is a great synopsis. I'm learning as you're saying this, but where to next? People first. Everything you're doing now, you've left the Liberal National Party behind. And you've described yourself to me in the past, I think, which stuck with me. You said, I'm not here as a career politician, you're here to make a difference.
Exactly.
Right? So you've got a different motivation to most of them who are in charge now, right?
Yeah. So last time I spoke, I was still in the Liberal Party. I knew I'd be in trouble in my pre-selection because I withheld my vote over the people being injured. Subsequently, as it turned out, we've been proven correct, but that doesn't matter when you're in a major party. All they care about is obedience. So whether you do the right thing morally and put the people first, that's not what it's about. When you're in a party, you got to put the party
line.
Yeah, it's a party line, party first, people last. I believe in people first, party last. Hence, but here's the thing. When I went to the pre-selection, I lost by 3 votes and there were about 7 different irregularities. Even though these irregularities were raised, so I appealed, the party basically refused to deal with it. So I had supporters that wanted me to fight it internally in the party. So I spent another year after the pre-selection fighting the party through courts. The judge ultimately that heard us. So the party didn't dispute the merits. They acknowledged that there were these irregularities and that they cheated. But here's the thing, they didn't go to court on that. They basically, when I said, okay, well, I want to appeal to State Council, they said it's too late to appeal, which was complete and utter rubbish. So that wasn't even in the Constitution. The Constitution, the party's Constitution said I could appeal. So we went to court and the judge said that he can't rule on unincorporated bodies and that and on party constitutions. Now, what's interesting was 15 years earlier he said the complete opposite. So, you know, I don't want to. We won't go into that other than the fact that, you know, the rules would, you know, apply differently, and that the party cheated, and so I was like, okay, I did, you know, for those people that wanted me to fight the fight within the party, I've done that. I've got just under a year left on this Senate term.
Yep.
I'm not going to stay with a party that I know, you know, didn't do the right thing in COVID. Now, we can have arguments over if they did the right thing in the first year of COVID or whatever, but it's undisputable that they didn't treat the people injured by the vaccine.
Absolutely.
So, and the other thing was I wanted to also, one of the things about when you're in a major party, you're gagged. You can't talk about solutions, right? And I wanted to talk about solutions. I want to talk about what we just talked about then. So I wanted the last year of this particular term to actually go out and provide an alternative to the major parties where we focus on solutions and we stop this internal bickering between the two major parties. Even this week, we saw it in estimates this week, where estimates was stopped a number of times because they were just fighting each other, and we chewed up so much time rather than, you know, asking questions of the bureaucrats. So I guess that's why I really wanted to run. I couldn't stay within a party that, you know, like, you know, conscience-wise, I knew that they were corrupt. So my view was I couldn't stay within them.
Can't stay with that,
yeah. And I wanted to provide solutions, and I really believe. I didn't join any other minor parties because I didn't want to talk about ourselves. And you've probably seen in the last week, you know, Clive Palmer's come out of the blue. He's trying to get this trouble to Patriots up. And we're all talking about ourselves again. That's the worst thing we can be doing. We need to be talking about how we can put solutions, like and implement solutions that is going to make life easier for Australians.
Let's talk about those solutions and what to expect.
Sure.
You know, like, where the hell do you start is my first thing, but what's your approach to this and what sort of things are you looking at implementing?
Okay, yeah, thanks, Adam. So the first thing, and this is something I've always been very passionate about, is that people who earn less than the cost of living shouldn't be taxed. So, you know, our first policy is we want to lift the tax-free threshold to $40,000. So that means that currently you pay tax above $18,200 at the moment. It's 16 cents in the dollar plus 2% Medicare. So by the time you get to earn about $40,000, you pay just under $4,000 in income tax, and 12% of $4,000 superannuation is another $5,000 in superannuation. So your take-home pay for $40,000 is $31,000, give or take, you know, $500, right? So that is pushing people back below the poverty line. Now, anyone that gets out of bed, puts their nose to the grindstone, we want to make sure they keep their, you know, head above the water. So I want to lift that tax-free, say People First want to lift that tax-free threshold to $40,000. That's the first policy we want to do. I'll talk about how we fund that in a minute. The second thing I want to do is I want to pay childcare directly to the parent in the form of a voucher, and that voucher can pay for anything bar, you know, grogs, cigarettes and gambling.
So you can get grandma in to look after them.
Absolutely, yeah. Or if you're a shift worker, and this is what childcare doesn't help. If you're a shift worker, so you're a nurse or a policeman, you're working late, doesn't help. If you're working weekends, it doesn't help because childcare centres aren't open weekends. So you might just want to get a nanny in for 3 hours. Like you might, you know, the husband might come home and you might go out and work in a bar for 3 hours or whatever, vice versa. You might or there might be a bit of a crossover, so you might only need a nanny for 2 hours. Or you might just want to pay grandma and granddad a bit of extra money to keep their head above water. And what better form of childcare than your own grandparents, right? But it's giving greater choice. But also, like if you're fly in, fly out, why should you pay for, say you're 10 days on, 7 days off? Why do you need to pay for childcare when you're home on what's effectively your weekend? Do you know what I mean? Like people might rather pay for the childcare when the minor, let's say the husband's away. So it gives much greater flexibility. Because ultimately, my problem with childcare is it's pulling the child away from the parent.
It's canning to the state, right?
Absolutely. Yeah, and don't forget we've got the Dawkins plan. So, you know, they're also getting more education at the top end as well when a lot of them should be out, you know, getting a job early on. So we want to make it childcare support more flexible because obviously we recognise the importance of the family. And especially, and we're talking in those early years, especially between 0 and 3. I'm not against 5-day fortnight. I mean, kindy. Like we went to 5-day fortnight kindies. You know, you go from say 9 till 2, 5 days a fortnight. You know, so 3 days one week, 2 days the next week, and you know, you're starting the year before you start school, where you're slowly work your way into a
and
schooling
without
system.
diverting you too much from that, but that also, I mean, I couldn't send my kids to childcare because I didn't want to vaccinate them, and there was a mandate on having them vaccinated.
Yeah.
So does that roll into this somehow?
So that's not one of our 5 key policies. Okay. That's under our health policy, but we want to remove no jab, no pay.
All right. I just want to throw that in because that'll be a question if everyone's listening to this going, what about that?
Sure. No. And we don't believe in that. We think parents have the choice and you shouldn't be blackmailed or, if that's the right, bribed or whatever, pressured
it's coerced.
Coerced is the word, into having to get your children vaccinated. It's interesting. So there's that as well. Now, so that's the second policy.
Back to policy, yes.
Yeah, back to policy. So the third one is we want to make superannuation voluntary. Superannuation is a false economy. Effectively, today, 40% of people that retire with a mortgage. That's up from 10% in 1992.
Yep.
We still have the same percentage of retirees on a pension as what we did in 1992. So we're not reducing the load off. It's not fixing it at all. The tax concessions for superannuation that mainly go to the upper 20%, and I'm one of them, is about $60 billion a year. The cost of the pension is $54 billion. So the cost of superannuation is now greater than the cost of the pension. So in other words, it would be cheaper just to if you got rid of the superannuation concessions and turned that into an income tax cut, that's 14 million workers pay $4,000 a pop, 56 billion. If you could shift and this is over and above what I can get to 40 without doing that, another $4,000 in tax cuts would get you a tax-free threshold of about 55 grand. Suddenly, so the first 55 grand you earn. So that's another reason. There's another $30 to $40 billion a year in fees just to pay to financial engineers that are shuffling money through super accounts, industry funds, and of the $4 trillion in superannuation, over $1 trillion of it is now invested offshore. So that money is leaving the country, and when it should be invested in infrastructure here.
Truly, yeah.
It's as well as that. So another policy we've got. This is one of the key ones. But not only that, we now have about 17 or 18 industry funds controlled by unions, and about another 10 retail funds controlled by the private sector. Between those, say, 25 super funds, they control $3 trillion in non-SMF money. So when you control $3 trillion in capital, you control industry.
Yeah.
So every time you land on a plane and they do a welcome to country, when they back the voice or they're pushing all this woke stuff, that's all coming from the boardrooms of these superannuation funds. You take the combined vote of the industry funds, they use one proxy advisor when they vote at AGMs. So that proxy advisor goes and collects the votes from all the super funds. They control over 20% of most major companies here in Australia. That's not BlackRock and Vanguard. So BlackRock and Vanguard get given control of the 10% or so, or those other 10 retail super funds, the private ones. A lot of them use BlackRock, Vanguard, and State Street.
Yep.
So combined, you've got over 30 to 40% of shares now are controlled by those super funds on the stock exchange. You've then got another 20 or 30% that are genuinely foreign owned. So our banks are 20% or 30% foreign owned, where foreigners come in and buy. So between the foreigners and the super funds, they're running the country, right? So much for sort of having, true capitalism where you're risking your own capital. So one of our policies is
it explains a great deal.
is those boards have to be elected. I mean, we're going to make it superannuation voluntary anyway, but even if you don't put your money into superannuation, that board, you have to be able to vote who runs that money, controls your money, because at the moment that's not happening. So that is I call superannuation communism, because you've got 3 trillion plus $1 trillion in self-managed super funds, but that 3 trillion there's no accountability for any of it. And not only that, they can then vote in AGMs. They don't have to go back to their members and ask how they should vote. They just vote. So they don't get elected. So they're now controlling $3 trillion in capital. And you wonder why we're going backwards as a country, because they're pushing all this woke ideology instead of being driven by productivity.
It's very insightful.
And those first 3 policies are really important because they all put money back into the pockets of families. So, you're going to save $3,500 in income tax. You get to keep 12% of your superannuation if you want to, and you can get your childcare paid to you directly. So that is going to
make
a big difference. I'd like to think it'd make a big difference for people.
Absolutely.
So the fourth thing is, how do we pay for that? We pay for it by basically getting rid of the defined benefit schemes for retired bureaucrats in Canberra. There's a liability of $340 billion on that I've had costed. That's worth about $10 to $15 billion each year. The other way is to get rid of subsidies for renewables. That's worth about $5 or $6 billion every year. And the other thing is I want to actually streamline the bureaucracy. So that's going to involve removing the duplication of services between the federal and state government, education, health, water, energy, tourism, Aboriginal affairs. Missing a big one there. I can't think of what it was. But anyway, there'd be another $5 billion in savings
Plenty
there.
of them.
Very
Yeah.
easy. Yeah,
Yep.
it would be very easy. So I'll touch on that. And then the last thing I want to do, and this is the fifth key policy, is bring back a public bank. So older people would be old enough to remember Commonwealth Bank used to be publicly owned. We sold it for $8 billion. Now it makes $10 billion a year. But that would enable people to access branches, access cash. And as well as that, we would offer, like the bank should offer a longer fixed term home loan, because most home loans, the longest you can get a fixed home loan for is 5 years. There are a few longer packages out there, but we want it to go longer. So that would then take away power from the RBA, because the RBA have a lot of power over people, because most people use variable loans. And of course you can go from 6% down to 3% back to 6% like that. And so we want to take that power away. The other thing is we want a government insurance office, and it's because insurance costs are through the roof. And the last thing, and I won't explain this in a great deal of detail, is we want an infrastructure bank that is going to build 7 sovereign assets: dams, power stations, road, rail, ports, airports and telecommunications. So it will fund internally those assets rather than us going and using foreign debt. So instead of using, if you know what a balance sheet looks like, you've got an asset over here, you've got a debt here and equity here. As a sovereign country, we have equity over all that untapped wealth. So a dam, for example, all you've got to do is dig a hole in the ground, water falls into it. Mother Nature gives us that stuff for free. We have title over that. We're just going to, by creating an infrastructure bank and getting the infrastructure bank that's federal government, owned by the federal government, i.e. the people, they will issue an infrastructure bond to the state government. When the state government repays that bond to build the dam, say for $1 billion, that $1 billion stays here in Australia. It doesn't go offshore. So what that will do is reduce the cost of infrastructure for the governments, which means we reduce taxes. And once we own that infrastructure, that starts generating more income. So they're the 5 key policies.
Love it. Yeah. Okay. That makes a lot of sense, and I can see with the background in the finance industry is playing out there too, which I like. Question for a lot of us will have is, that's the policies. What scenario do you need to have to be able to implement that?
Okay, so ideally, we need to get we've got to crawl before we can walk. So we've got 2 houses in Parliament. We have a House of Representatives in the lower house, 150 members. They get elected on the basis of getting the 50% of the two-party preferred vote. Right, so you've got to get, this is why the 2 majors tend to dominate in the lower house, because they'll get 30 or 40% of the vote, and then they'll get preferences from the minor parties. The Senate is based on proportional representation. So if you can get to, there's 6 senators that are up for spots, 6 Senate spots up for grabs every election. That means you've got to get 14% of the vote to get a Senate spot. At the minor parties, let's call them the freedom parties. I know a lot of people are sick of that term, which is fair enough. But let's call them the freedom parties so everyone knows what we're talking about. Gets about 10 to 12% of the vote now. So we need to work together to get a Freedom Party senator up in every state. I've put a proposal forward that I go first, people first represents for Queensland, Libertarians, New South Wales. I've said to Trumpeter Patriots, if you want Victoria, I'm happy to work with you there. And Family First in South Australia, and then there's still Western Australia and Tasmania up for grabs. But we need to get 12 senators into Parliament in the Senate so that we have the balance of power in the Senate. Now, the reason why that's our first step is because if we get the balance of power, we can then block votes if we need to be, right? So let's assume that the coalition get in, but they're just a little bit short, is that they will need those 6 senators, and after 2 election cycles, 12 senators, to get anything passed. So what we do then is so these policies that people first felt policies, these policies should be embraced by the coalition, because they say they believe in smaller government, greater choice and family values.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Right? So the plan is that if we can get the balance of power, we then wedge them. So anytime they want our vote on something, I'm going to turn around to them and say, well, you need to introduce one of our policies. So that's the mechanism. But we've actually, and don't sort of punch me in the head for saying this, but we need to actually replicate what the Greens have done on the left. So Bob Brown and Pauline Hanson got into federal parliament at the same time in 1996. Today the Greens have 12 senators and 4 lower house members. The Freedom Party people have basically 3 senators, 2 from One Nation and Ralph Babbitt.
Yep.
Right? They don't have the balance of power. And Ralph currently is homeless in the sense that UAP can't even run in this election. So we need to get 12 senators up. And to do that, I believe that we need to become more professional and polished and disciplined. We need to lose the personality cult behind a lot of these parties. One Nation, for example, doesn't have state divisions, right? So if you want to get senators up in other states, you've got to have state divisions. You've got to delegate to each state so that they can get a vibrant grassroots movement. Because you would have heard the expression, you can't fatten a pig on market day. This needs to be a gradual progression where we get a really strong grassroots movement going, and we get really good Senate candidates who high calibre, so when they get into the Senate, they can bring more people from the mainstream over, if that makes sense. And we've got to be able, by all means, we've got to use emotion at times, but it's very important that we also use logic and be rational and also stay very calm and professional and polished when we're pushing forward ideas. Because if we start getting engaged and fighting, and there's a fair bit of that goes on at the moment with the crossbench as well, we'll just turn people off. So that is the plan, is to basically get a good grassroots movement. I distinguish myself from the Libertarians. The Libertarians want the corporations. They believe that the market can fix everything. I don't trust big corporations. I've worked for big corporations. I don't trust big government. I believe in the people, and I believe that we have to. And it's not a conspiracy theory or anything like that. Big organisations, the larger they get, if they're not well managed, every time you pass a decision down the chain, chain of command, you get, that it's never replicated the same way. So it's Elon Musk is probably a good example. He's the outlier, but he literally runs everything. His own companies, you'll see him, he goes into his own companies and he sits down with the people. Like, it's a very flat structure, right? Most big organisations have a very hierarchical structure and everyone's protecting their little patch. So in the same way you've seen the Liberal Party carry on about not acknowledging injuries from the vaccine, or the Labor Party, that happens in big corporations as well, because everyone's protecting their turf. Yeah,
and there's also those in charge of those corporations are separated from the consequences of their actions by how many people and chains of command.
Absolutely, and so that's one of the myths I'm trying to break too. Because while I don't believe in free markets, because the only free market I know of is a charity, I do believe in capitalism. But true capitalism is people who risk their own capital. So it's
that's a good distinction.
And so it can be the carpenter or the bricklayer that gets out of bed and puts their nose to the grindstone every day, because they're risking their human capital. And so this dichotomy, it's not the left versus right, or capitalism versus communism. It's actually the little guy versus the big guy. And those big organisations, the people that run those big organisations, whether it's big bureaucracy, who waste our taxes, big corporations who blow up shareholders' money, big super funds that are spending, members' money on corporate boxes at the tennis. Those guys, or even big unions that are blowing up members' union fees, pushing ideologies not representing their members. So that's the thing. We've got to protect the people, because it's the people, in my view, are the real capitalists. It's not just financial capital; it's also human capital, and we've got to make sure they're rewarded for their effort, because they're the ones who are risking. And it's risking taking the risks.
Absolutely, it makes a great deal of sense to me. I want to ask about your impression, or your thoughts on. You talked about staying. Like, I've got to give you are calm under pressure in ways I just take the hat off. I would have lost my shit with some of the questions you get and the stuff you get in Senate and things. But at the same time, we've got a US president now who's a big personality, was one on personality, arguably. And, Musk is there, Doge is going through doing a cleanup, sort of along, re-examining the bureaucratic spend and so on, and taking some pretty strong actions. What is your read on what's happening over there? Does it have is there a parallel over here that you see playing out, or do we need a parallel of that, or is it irrelevant? Can you comment on it?
Absolutely. Look, there is a parallel here in our bureaucracy as well. It's probably not as bad as what was going on in the States, because we're not as big and as powerful. But I was on to this as soon as I got into the Senate. I mean, the bureaucrats. I mean, I guess my father has had a big influence on me, as you expect. But I mean, he's been whinging about the bureaucrats for years.
Mine too.
Yeah. So I remember being told in our first set of estimates, we were given a little half-hour briefing on what to do, and I was told by a Liberal Party shadow minister who wasn't then, but he is now a Liberal Party shadow minister, that the point of estimates is not to make the government look bad. And at that point, we were the ones in government. I was like, whoa. I sorry, but I'm going to hammer the bureaucrats. I don't care who's in government, because these guys are the real people. These are the shadow government, because they're there all the time. And even you take the ministers, they do 19 weeks of parliament. They do probably 10 weeks in their own electorate. They'll do 10 weeks in other electorates flying around the country. So they may, if they're lucky, have 10 weeks doing their job as a minister, which is being an executive of that particular department, right? You're the CEO of that department. Now, given that most of these people don't even have subject knowledge matter of the industry, so Greg Hunt didn't know anything about health, nor does Mark Butler. These guys know a lot more. And we just, literally last night, with the Epstein files, it turns out now that the FBI have been withholding more data on the Epstein files. So, you have to be... So we have the same issues here. I mean, I just did a thing in estimates this week where the Senate twice asked the Labor government for the business case for that $100 million road to Albanese's new beach house at Copacabana Beach. They won't give it to us. They're defying the will of the Senate. And they're just pushing that down the line in the hope that I don't get re-elected, so I don't pursue it any further. So we have got the same issues as what's going on in the States, maybe not to the same degree, but they're valid issues. And look, people say, do we need a Dodge? Well, what we really need are ministers who know what they're doing and have the intelligence and the willpower, so that, because we can have a Doge and then it just goes back to business as usual where they're wasting money. What we really need are people who know what they're doing in Parliament. Or actually, let me rephrase that, because I've actually changed my mind about the Westminster system. I prefer the Washington system since I've come into power, because I don't believe the executive should sit within Parliament. So what we've got, we don't have a genuine, in my view, separation of powers between the executive and Parliament in this country, because we have only 150 lower house MPs and 76 senators. The caucus room of the governing party, so caucus is both the combined number of the lower house MPs plus the senators, is now less than 100, because we've got more and more crossbenchers, right? That means that by the time you add up the ministers and the assistant ministers, and then all the people that want to become a minister, so they're all the committee chairs that get an extra $20,000 or $30,000 a year for being a committee chair as well. They do what they're told and they shut up, and they tell the backbenchers to shut up. So that means that backbenchers won't really fight the fight because they feel like they're under trouble. And you saw what happened when I took a stand. I got basically, they did anything to get rid of me, right? So at least in Washington, their executives, so Secretary of State, Secretary of Transport, they call them secretaries over there, they are handpicked by the president. So the president is the executive, and that sits different to Congress and the Senate. We need the same thing here. The UK gets away with it because they have 650 people in their lower house, whereas we only have 150, right? So their ministry isn't much bigger than ours, but their backbench in the governing party will be 300 backbenchers to 50 ministers, 6 to 1, whereas here it's about a 1-to-1 ratio. So the executive has a big influence over the Parliament, and there's not a true separation of powers. So I'd like to see our ministers come from outside of Parliament, and they can be handpicked because they've got experience in that industry, number one. And I'd actually I used to think compulsory voting was a good thing, and I can see why the argument's still a valid one, that it does give us stability. But I think what we've seen in Western democracies in the last 50 years is that stability has turned into stagnation. So there's two sides. There's two decent arguments there. But when you've got what we've now got today that we didn't have 50 years ago, when political parties were much bigger, is we have a thing called an iPhone. So people today, they don't have to leave home. There is so much in-house entertainment that the community groups just aren't what they used to be. 50 years ago, you might have had a couple of radio stations and 1 or 2 TV channels, and one of those channels would come on at 3 o'clock in the afternoon or 6 o'clock at night. I can remember we had cartoons on school holidays. That was a big deal. Now you've got cartoons on 24 hours a day.
24/7 sort of thing, yeah.
So you don't have to, and so you'd be bored, and then the cartoons would finish at 11 o'clock in the morning, you'd go out and play. on school holidays. Right now, the kids don't have to do anything. And that's the thing. People, it's too easy not to get bored. So people just don't have to go out. So we really need. So we've got a lot of apathy, a lot of distraction going on in the world, and unfortunately, people are just we all do get comfortable in their own rut. So we need to. People have to get more engaged, or apathy is what will kill us in the end.
I think we've proven that as a nation in the last few years.
I mean, to be fair to people, and look, you've got people out there that are trying to make ends meet. You've got, people that work in their local sporting clubs that are heavily involved in sporting clubs, community clubs, volunteer organisations. Some people have sick parents, sick children. They do a lot of work up at the school. So
two parents working and all the things. It's systemic, right?
Yeah, it's systemic.
It's not a blame on them. It's,
exactly. That's right. And they've got to do what they have to do to survive. And this is why we really want one parent staying at home, because that one parent can get more heavily involved in school and community groups and have a little bit more energy and time to devote to these things. Because when you're coming home, if you're both working, you're coming home and you've got to put the kids to bed and everything like that. The last thing you want to do is turn around and go back out to a school P&F, right?
I know.
So whereas if the mother's been home or the father's been home all day, they might go, well, I'll go out because we'd go out. It'd be good to talk to someone, right? But if you've been in the office all day talking to people, you're like, no, I need some time, chill out time. Yeah.
Just, I've got to ask you questions for the next 3 hours, but we only have that sort of time. You have schedule after this. But I do want to go back quickly to some of the pertinent, for our audience, parents, and, we have a chronic disease crisis here, right behind the if not overtaking the US, but we're right there. Kids getting obesity and diabetes and so on, autism. And, we've seen what Big Pharma have been up to and their disregard for the health of us and our children. What's the broader, what does People First have to say about that? What are the policies on that? I guess I'm asking clumsily, sorry.
Well, look, we basically want a complete overhaul of the TGA. So the TGA needs to be split in two, and the people that actually review the vaccine injuries need to be completely removed from the people that approve the product. They should not get their funding. So 96% of the TGA's funding comes from Big Pharma. They need to be, that money, so Treasury need to take control of the funding of the TGA. So and the TGA employees need to be told, you're going to get this regardless of what you get from Big Pharma. So they don't need to rely on Big Pharma, because too many, and it's not just the TGA, too many independent statutory authorities have been told they've got to generate enough income to pay for themselves. The problem with that is that invokes regulatory capture. Okay, so we have to clean up, and I say we obviously need the states and that to do it as well, because we are heavily influenced by the states. Now, RFK Jr. getting in is a great thing, because he will go after these guys. And, JD Vance has admitted he was pretty much vaccine injured. So, we've got the Vice President and the Health Secretary in the states going after Big Pharma, which is drastically needed. One of our policies is also that Big Pharma doesn't have their liability removed. We have a no-fault vaccine injury claim. And obviously we will fight to continue to get compensation for those people that are injured by the vaccine. We can have a Royal Commission into what happened in COVID. What we really want, though, is that's a means to an end, is those people that did what they did in COVID be held to account, and that means jail time. I mean, there was genuine negligence there. But then in terms of obesity and things like that, that's it again, why we need a parent at home, why we need to be encouraging, and I'm not going to do this, we're not, the government's, we're not going to take responsibility for parenting, but what we would do is make it easier for a parent to stay at home. Because if we do that, then, it's up to the parents to make sure their kids get involved in the sport. We've got to stop eating, rubbish food and all those sort of things. But yet again, if parents at home, they've got time to do proper shopping and there's an apple and a banana.
And you can afford to go to groceries and so on.
Yeah, exactly. Absolutely. You're less inclined to pick up, a takeaway on the way home or whatever. So it'll give parents the time to actually put a proper feed on, a meal on the table at, say, 6:30, then read to the children, get them to bed so they sleep well. And get them out playing. Hopefully they'll have some spare time, at least for the parent that stays home to do the runaround, which is a full-time job. I mean, we're going right through that period now. We've got 3 children, 13, 11, and soon to be 8. And after school, it's full on.
Right?
Yeah,
me too.
Yeah.
Okay. interested in your journey because, as you spoke earlier about your ability to, well, for people to need to be calm under pressure.
Yeah.
And I've seen you get, absolutely on point, non-phased. You're right on, asking hard questions, unpopular questions.
Yeah.
Yet, and you've copped slander. That's all I'd call it, from so many places because of that. Even I looked on your Wikipedia before. You're still a conspiracy theorist, of course.
Oh, yeah.
That's where we have that in common as well.
Yeah.
What's that journey been like for you personally? I mean,
look, it rattled me early on. By the time, so many of your listeners wouldn't have been aware of my early stage when I was a Senate candidate, where the ABC did a 4-day pylon of me, and they called me a conspiracy theorist. Now, one of those issues was I had a crack at childcare then.
Yep.
I had a crack at the climate science issue then. They misrepresented my position on international tax structuring, which is where I want to lift the tax on profits sent offshore. And we've got to lift the tax on profits sent offshore above the tax on profits retained in Australia. So we stopped money going offshore. They said I wanted to give a tax cut to companies, which is not the case at all. I want to actually increase the tax on companies to pay for an income tax cut. I don't want to increase the overall level of tax, just be clear about that. And then my party, being typical, the Liberal Party, told me I couldn't do any more postings. So rather than back me in on what I said, which was all accurate, none of it was slander, none of it was like being homophobic, racist or anything like that. It was all policy driven. But that really rattled me back at the time. The other thing they accused me of was that I bribed my way to the pre-selection, right? Now, what had happened was that in 2017, I was my SEC, and a good mate of mine was running as the candidate for the state election. I was asked to be treasurer. So part of the role as treasurer is to pick up the phone and ask people for money. And I don't like asking people for money, right? So I just put my own money in because I didn't want it. So I just paid, like we did a fundraiser where I just paid for the whole lot and paid for some of the advertising because I just didn't feel comfortable asking. But they accused that, then they turned that around rather than saying I just paid my own way. And I paid my own way in the federal election. Like I put in, I won't say how much, but a lot of money in 2019 because I don't like asking people for money. I'm doing it with people first because I want people first to become sustainable. If we want this party, we've got to become a sustainable party.
Yep.
But I will put money in at the end of this once I get my costs sorted out. I'll top up what we need to do. But so that was really really rattled me. But over the first year, I got used to the slander. And I realised that a lot of this slander is just from people who didn't have a clue about what they were talking about. And I guess this is where having a really good upbringing has really helped me. Those blokes I went to school with back in my hometown of Chinchilla, they're still my mates today. Like we caught up about a couple of years just before I went into Parliament, and it was as though we hadn't seen some of these guys in over 20 years. So, I had a really, and I've had a really good set of mates that, all my life, I've been very lucky that way, and I've got a very good family life. Happily married, 3 beautiful children, so I'm very grateful for everything I have. So that family, that love for my family and the love they have for me, along with my mates, is kind of like a shield. So it doesn't really matter. Yet they can throw anything at me in the world. I know why I'm in politics, and that's because I want to make sure our children get the same opportunities as our forefathers gave to us. And the memory of my parents and my grandparents and all of our forefathers makes me determined to keep going. So I just know that all of these, that's just all noise. And the other thing is I've learned, interestingly enough, the first gotcha, and it was never on camera, it was just recorded on Hansard. We did a Senate inquiry into the Great Barrier Reef. And my first question to the Australian Institute of Marine Science was, do you have a database of all the health KPIs relating to the Great Barrier Reef for the last 40 years that demonstrates a trend that the Great Barrier Reef is dying? And of course they don't have that, right? They'll go and do a random study of some fish, and they'll go, these fish, there's less fish today than what there was 20 years ago, but the sample size might be 50 fish, right? Across an area of 3,000, that's 3,000 kilometres long. And so the answer was no, but of course they wouldn't answer that. But I sort of interrupted a couple of times and kept trying to say, well, I just want a yes or no, but she wouldn't say no. But two female senators were chipping me for interrupting her. But I learned very early on not to interrupt them, and I use social. I don't say I try not to get too argumentative. I let them do the talking, then we take the clip, and then I'll put my commentary on the clip so that people can see for themselves. I just let them lie, effectively. So I let them bury themselves and then post it, rather than letting. If I start interrupting too much, it becomes about the argument rather than the actual issue and the lie that they're telling. Because I can always have my say on social media when I post the clip. So. Look,
it's not your first rodeo, eh? You've been here and done this before.
yeah. And I'm sort of lucky now because and it was never the intention, but we managed to get quite a following on those particular issues across a range of issues. Obviously, not just COVID, but but I say that, I mean, we managed to do that. It's actually the bureaucrats who've managed to do it, because they just continually won't answer questions. They'll take it on notice, and people can see right through it. And you know what? One of the best lessons in life, bits of advice I was ever given to me in my working career, and it's for life in general, is that the only time you've made a mistake is when you know you've made a mistake and you don't do something about it. Right? No one's perfect. No one's ever got 100% for a subject at school, and certainly not for every subject. The key point is to admit when you got it wrong, and then fix that mistake.
Sure.
It's when you double down and you keep making the same mistakes that it becomes a problem. And that's what we saw with the vaccine rollout. Look, I can kind of understand why people fell for the need for a vaccine, even though I sort of knew enough to know it wasn't going to work. But once they knew it was injuring people and it wasn't stopping transmission, that's it. Game over.
That should be enough, right?
Yeah, it should be enough. But they just keep on doubling down.
I guess if you grow up in a world in that environment, in bureaucracy where there's no accountability anyway, you're encouraged to.
Well, you don't have to grow up in the world. It's like, if you speak out, you lose your job.
Yeah.
So, and this is the problem with too much debt, right? Back in the day when debt wasn't as much, or you paid your debt off by the time you're 40 instead of 60, you could, let's say you paid your debt off at 40, by the time you're 45, you might have saved a bit extra plus your house. You go, hey, you know what? I don't need to put up with this. I'm going to quit my job. But if you're struggling with debt, you've got kids at school,
you do as you're told.
You do as you're told, because you can't afford to walk, or you lose your house, right? Yeah. It's not just your job, you lose your house, your kids might struggle, and no one wants that, right? So this is the problem as well. Like, too much debt then gags people, whether they like it or not. And the other thing, I'll say today, we mightn't have the old brown paper bags of yesteryear, but what those brown paper bags have turned into is green tape, red tape, black tape, and blue tape in the bureaucracy. Yeah. Whereby all these rules and regulations are a form of just grifting, the bureaucracy grifting off the private sector. Yeah.
Agree with that one. I guess the question is, what would you have our audience do if what you're saying, if they resonate with what you're saying, what's the next course of action? How can we support? How do they get involved? How can we contribute to what you're here to achieve? Yeah,
thanks, Adam. Appreciate the question. Well, look, first of all, politics isn't a spectator sport. We've got to get on the field. So I would say get involved with a political party. I mean, it doesn't have to be People First, but I'd love you to join the party. If you wanted to join the party, it's www.peoplefirstparty.au. You can become a member, donate, or volunteer at the election. We have closed candidates off just because the election can be called any day now, so we need to focus on the campaign and getting all those people who have nominated registered with the AEC, which will require work. But long story short, look, sharing posts and everything on social media is good, but if you're spending 10 hours a week on social media, pull it back to 8 hours or 7 hours and put 2 hours into helping out a party. And as I said before, you can't fatten a calf on market day or pig on market day. So you want to get involved. We want to build up the membership of these minor parties, preferably, and we can merge some of these minor parties. I don't think we'll merge all the parties, but we don't need to, but we just need to keep the number. We just need to be very constructive, if you're not going to merge completely.
Sure.
But get involved and as well as that, if you don't like politics and you don't want to get involved with the political system, get involved with your school system through the school P&F or P&C. If you don't like what your sporting body's doing and they're, making everyone wear pink socks or something, get involved with the sporting body. Or if you, in your employee groups, get involved with your industry groups. But make a contribution to your community somehow. Obviously, as a politician, I'd say do it through a political party, but it doesn't always have to be through a political party. You know, politics is downstream of culture. I think the school system, you know, yet again, why we really need a parent staying at home, because one parent can go to the P&F, get involved with the school tuck shop. You know, if you're doing a school pickup, you know, when I was a stay-at-home dad for a few years before becoming a senator, you know, me and a few blokes, older dads, you know, there was it was about a third of the class actually. My eldest son's prep class were about older dads, you know, so we had a drinking squad on the Friday night, you know, but when, you know, I called all those guys.
We used to have one called Pubs and Bubs.
Yeah, right.
Pubs and Bubs Club.
yeah. And but that's the importance of being involved with the school community, because to be fair to a lot of principals, they don't agree with some of this stuff that's coming down through the bureaucracy either. But unless they get enough support from the parents to push back on that stuff, you know, they can't change anything either.
Yeah.
So, you know, I mean, because I do respect teachers. It's easy to bag out, you know, the teachers union and all that sort of stuff. But I still believe that majority of teachers are very good people. You know, it's not easy. It's hard enough. I mean, I struggle with my own 3 children, so let alone in a classroom of 25 to 30 children, especially if they're from disadvantaged backgrounds. So, you know, yet again, if we can get people involved just in the overall community and lift that community engagement so that the power of isn't so centralised with the bureaucrats of the world and big corporations. But, you know, we've really got to bring that third wheel back, you know, big companies, big bureaucracy, but, you know, that community spirit through the people.
And I want to add something to that, and I think it's really important, is that, and I'm sure you've experienced, it's like, we don't want to sit back and go, it's all right, Gerard's going to do this for us, or it's like, it's hero syndrome. We don't need that.
You
lead and we'll take our own leadership. We'll empower ourselves.
Yeah, exactly. And that's exactly right, is that it is all about empowerment, not dependency. And that's what we really want to do. And yet again, you know, we should be raising our own children. We don't want the childcare. We, you know, make it easier for us to raise our own children. Superannuation. Tell us we're the ones who have to save for our own retirement. And because superannuation used to be called savings. You know, there's this change in language. You know, the virus, you know, the flu has now become COVID. The weather's now become climate change. Savings has become superannuation. And these terms are used by the government to manipulate people into thinking that the government's the one with the solutions, right? Well, no, we've got to embrace self-responsibility, empowering ourselves, and know, because the people that, you know, we all know this, at the end of the day, the only people you can rely on are the people, you know, in our closest sphere, our family and things like that. So that's where we want to go. Yeah.
Are you hopeful? Are you feeling hopeful?
I'm up against it, but I'm not going to go down without a fight, because I'm going to stick it to the Liberals for getting rid of me, because they got rid of me for the wrong reasons and they cheated. B, you know, I owe it to those people that backed me to fight until the last day. I mean, I'm still paid up to June the 30th, and if I can get another 6 years, I'll fight. And I want to, you know, really emphasise the importance. We have to get much more professional in terms of at the minor parties. And I guess that's what I want to do as well, is just raise that level, because, you know, we owe it to our followers to provide them better representation. And that actually means, and I'll finish this, but, you know, we can't always go, we want to get out of this and want to get out of that, right? Like I don't actually, you know, don't want to necessarily get out of the UN. I'm happy to get out of the WEF. We're not in the WEF, right? That's a bit of a myth that we're in the WEF. The WEF is just this think tank that has an influence, but its influence is no greater than what, say, Piers Morgan or Tucker Carlson has, right? They do get a little bit of government funding. It's generally in the millions, not the billions. But I can assure you that the intelligence agencies don't pick up the phone to Klaus Schwab every morning saying, which country should we take over today, right? Like, they're not the ones pulling the strings. So we need to be focusing on the you know, the deep state. I know that's sort of a bit conspiratorial, but it is true. We're seeing that, you know, that's been completely exposed now in the States. And you know, yet again, love the United States, hate the deep state, if you know what I mean. You know, I guess that's where we want to go, is really focus down on the service delivery by our governments, quality assurance by our governments, and empowering ourselves so that we're not so dependent on them. Because, you know, freedom's often is an overused word, but probably the word I prefer to use for freedom is the more self-reliant you are, the more and the greater independent, you know, more, you know, the less dependent you are on the government, the greater freedom you do have.
It's getting your freedom handed to you is one thing. What you're going to do with it as an adult is another. I've often say in simple terms, it's like, it's not just about waking people up. It's about we've got to wake up and then grow up. And become adults and self-sovereign again.
That's exactly right. Yeah.
Well, look, I can say on behalf of so many people in our audience, I just hear this a lot, and myself personally, your courage in standing up, your commitment to the truth of it, your rock solid steadiness under fire has been so appreciated, and I know you're going to get a big round of rousing support from our audience on your quest to make this all happen. So good luck from us.
Yeah, thanks very much, Adam. I appreciate it. Yeah, thanks for having me on.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, cheers, guys.